Hello, this is Janet back with you on the festivals of the Bible. It's been a while since we talked about Passover, Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of Firstfruits, or what we call Easter or Resurrection Day. And we are approaching now the next festival in the Scriptures, which is Pentecost. In the Hebrew, it's called Shavuot, which means the Feast of Weeks. And why is it called that? Well, one of the reasons is the days leading up to that time. Now, in our next gathering, we're going to get together and talk about Shavuot itself. But right now, today, I want to talk about those intervening days. Pentecost is an anglicized Greek word that means the 50th day. So why is the 50th day significant? Well, because God commanded that we observe 50 days. I want to go back to Torah, and in the book of Leviticus 23, where he commanded to count the days in between. And this is in Leviticus 23, verse 15. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath. Now remember, there was a Sabbath, Passover was a Sabbath, but the Feast of Firstfruits was also a Sabbath day. So we start that day, we start counting immediately after. When Yeshua was raised from the dead, the clock started ticking toward Pentecost, toward Shavuot, and what that means. So from that day, you shall count 50 days. It says from the day after the Sabbath, and bring the sheaf of the wave offering. 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. So that's 7 weeks. You've got to have 7 Sabbaths in between. And so 7 times 7, 7 weeks or days in a week, that's 49 days. So for 49 days, you have to count them. And then in verse 16, it says, count the 50th day to the day after the 7th Sabbath. So whichever day comes after the 7th Sabbath, that's the 50th day. And you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. So this again is a different kind of a first fruits, which is going to be Shavuot. But it's Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, because we count 7 weeks. So that gives you a little background. Now what I want to talk about are these intervening days, because each day the children of Israel were commanded to count the Omer. It's called Lag BaOmer, is the 33rd day, and I want to focus on that in just a minute. So each day they would count. And these were by the way, what this was the time beginning when they came out of the Red Sea. When the Red Sea parted and they passed through it, it was those 3 days that Yeshua was in the grave. 3 days and 3 nights, and I talked to you about that previously. When they came up out of the Red Sea, they began their journey to Mount Sinai, the mountain of our God. So it took them 47 days actually to get to Sinai. And there were 3 days required, as Torah says, that they have to purge themselves, they have to immerse themselves, get clean, they have to prepare themselves to meet God at the mountain. So we're in the process now. Imagine that we've come out of the Red Sea and we're counting the days until we get to the holy mountain of our God. Now today is April 21st, and this is actually, I've written down some notes here so I can keep it straight myself. And looking at the days that we're counting, but today is the 27th day of counting the Omer. Now, that's 27 days from the Feast of Easter, Resurrection, First Fruits, when Yeshua rose from the dead. And we've passed through the Red Sea, and we're now coming toward the mountain of our God in preparation for Pentecost, for Shavuot. Now, there's an interesting day coming up in a few days, on April 27th, 2013. It will be the 33rd day of counting the Omer. Now, it's interesting that that day is set aside as kind of almost a celebration. And people are not quite sure why, but there's a lot of history in the Israelite nation that shows the number 33. Remember, God is the wonderful numberer. It's a name that he was called in the book of Daniel in the Hebrew. He teaches us to number our days. In the Psalms it says that. So they are numbering their days as they're moving toward Mount Sinai. Now on the 33rd day, though, they're to actually have a little bit of a celebration, and that day is called Lag BaOmer. And even now, in the midst of this counting, they'll stop on that day and have maybe a festival or a special dinner or something. But 33, numerically in the Hebrew, connects to promises. Somehow the scriptures have connected that number to promises. For instance, Noah, his name was mentioned 33 times in the book of Genesis. On the 33rd occasion that Noah's name was recorded in the Torah, in Genesis, that was the day that God gave the blessing, the covenant, the promise, if you will, that he would never destroy the earth again by water. And the sign of that covenant was a rainbow. And that was the 33rd time that Noah's name was called out in the scriptures. Also, Abraham's name was mentioned many times, of course, but on the 33rd occasion of Avraham, his name being mentioned in Torah, was the day that God promised him a son. It was the son of the covenant. And the sign of Abraham's covenant was the Sabbath, the Shabbat. You can go back and read this in the Torah yourself. Now, Jacob's name, what happened on the 33rd day, or the 33rd time that Jacob's name, Yaakov's name is mentioned in Torah? It was the event where Jacob just offered up his tithe to the Lord, and he made a promise to the Lord, and in return, God sent the ladder down, the vision of the ladder, and he saw the angels descending up and down. And Jacob saw the promise of what was in the future for his people, that access into heaven. Now the name Elohim, which is the name of God, appears 33 times in the creation chapters of Genesis. And 33 is numerically associated with the Star of David, the Magen David. And I find that interesting because they believe that David was born and died on the 6th of Sivan, which is the Feast of Pentecost, by the way. But his name is, the 33 is associated with the sign. Again, signs and wonders and numbers and all of these things are the mysteries that are encoded in the scriptures in Hebrew. Now here's one of the best of all, of course, is Yeshua was 33 years old when he was crucified, died, buried at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, and rose again on first fruits. He was the first fruits of those who rose from the dead. That happened in his 33rd year. So here we are now, counting from that day that he rose from the dead. We're out on the April 27th. We're going to be at the 33rd day of counting the Omer. And it's associated with blessings, which is really great because and covenant promises. So what we've got going now is on that day, we are to remember that this is a day of celebration because we're getting ever closer to the day of the promise. And I find it quite curious that before he rose into heaven, and when he rose from the dead and before he ascended into heaven, in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 4, the disciples were together, and being assembled together with them, Yeshua commanded them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father. Again, there's another promise, another covenant promise. And what they were waiting for was the day of Pentecost, the feast of Shavuot to fully come. So that is an amazing coordination. Also, one more thing about the number 33. When you look at the book of Acts, chapter 2, coincidentally maybe, in verse 33, therefore being exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, he poured out that which you now see and hear. And so, and even verse 33 speaks of the promise, the covenant promise of the Father. There is a covenant promise that is fulfilled at the Feast of Shavuot. There's much more involved with that feast. But for today, we are in that interim season of counting the Omer. So as you approach the 33rd day, consider that that's a day of covenant promises. If there's a promise that you've been waiting for, that the Father has given you, that He will fulfill, look to that day with expectation. I can't say that it's going to happen that day, but the children of Israel looked to the 33rd day of counting the Omer, to a day of great expectation. And they were getting very close, because it is on the 50th day that promise will be fulfilled. And so until next time, when we talk more about the Feast of Shavuot, Shalom Aleichem, be blessed, walk in the health and promise of the Lord.